Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream that all men should be treated equally regardless of their race. He devoted his life in a peaceful fight against social injustice to end the discrimination and racism of Black Americans in the United States. His exceptional leadership was key to ending segregation and gaining equal rights for all U.S. citizens. He is remembered as one of the most important and influential civil rights leaders in American history. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. He was born as Michael King Jr., after the original name given to his father. A few years after being born, his dad traveled overseas and became inspired by the German religious leader Martin Luther, and decided to change his own name and his son's in his honor. And that's how Michael King Jr. became known as Martin Luther King Jr. His parents were both college educated. His mother was a former school teacher, and his father became the lead pastor at the prestigious Ebenezer Baptist Church after the death of his father-in-law in 1931. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in a comfortable middle-class family, along with his older sister Christine and younger brother Alfred, and attended segregated public schools in Georgia. Even at an early age, Martin Luther King Jr. was exposed to racism and segregation. Throughout the United States, Black Americans were constantly dealing with discrimination in employment, education, housing, public transport, and much more. It was even worse in the southern states, where Black Americans were kept from voting, denied entrance to public facilities, insulted, subject to brutality, and segregated or separated through some strict enforced laws that prevented them from the same rights as white people. Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was an early figure in the civil rights movement, fighting against inequality and teaching his children against racial discrimination, which left a deep impact on Martin. Martin was a gifted student who skipped 2 grades in high school. At age 15, he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta, the same college his father and grandfather had attended. Before beginning college, Martin spent the summer in Connecticut and discovered how it was possible for races to mix in the North and outside of the segregated South where he lived. This experience only fueled his dislike of racial segregation. After graduating from Morehouse in 1948, he studied at a seminary in Pennsylvania for the next 3 years and became acquainted with Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence movement. He later enrolled at Boston University for his doctorate, and while living there, he met aspiring singer and musician Coretta Scott. They married in 1953 and went on to have 4 children together: Yolanda, Martin Luther King III, Dexter, and Bernice. While still working on his thesis, Martin Luther King Jr. became pastor of a Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama, and in 1955, he earned his doctorate degree at only 25 years old. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old African-American woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a Montgomery city bus and was arrested and fined. At that time, Black Americans were required by law to sit in the back half of city buses or in designated areas and to surrender their seats to white passengers if the seats in the white section were full. To protest her arrest and fight segregated seating, Martin became the leader of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, where Black Americans refused to ride the city buses in Montgomery. The boycott brought Martin national recognition, and he emerged as a well-known leader of the American civil rights movement. But it also brought him much hatred among those unwilling to accept change. Almost 2 months into the bus boycott, his home was bombed while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Luckily, they were unharmed, and only the house was damaged. Despite this, Martin was committed to nonviolence and continued leading the boycott. Almost a year later, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the city of Montgomery to end racial segregation on its buses. After the success in Montgomery, Martin and other civil rights leaders founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, where they would coordinate nonviolent protests to fight for civil rights, and through which Martin would give speeches all around the country and discuss race-related problems. Already inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, and to better understand his successful nonviolent campaigns, Martin Luther King Jr. visited Gandhi's birthplace in India in 1959. After his trip, Martin became even more convinced that nonviolent resistance was the most powerful weapon to influence social change, and returned extremely committed to continue fighting for the civil rights of Black Americans. In 1960, Martin returned to his hometown of Atlanta, where he became co-pastor with his father at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, but he also continued fighting for civil rights. Spreading quickly across the country was the nonviolent SitIn Movement that had started in Greensboro, North Carolina, when 4 black students went to a segregated lunch counter and refused to leave when they were denied service because of their race. With the help of civil rights organizations, including the SCLC, the movement had gained national media coverage, thus increasing awareness of the civil rights movement. Urged by the young black activists to draw more attention to the campaign, Martin himself joined the protests and was arrested, along with dozens of others. The charges were dropped, but Martin was still jailed for violating probation for a minor traffic offense committed a few months earlier. He was soon released from jail, with the intervention of John F. Kennedy, who was running for the presidency at the time and with whom Martin had previously met to discuss civil rights. The SitIn movement became a success, and dining facilities across the South were desegregated. Birmingham, Alabama was a hard place for Black Americans, as it was one of the most segregated cities in the U.S. After months of organizing boycotts of the city's businesses and not achieving any progress, Martin and the other leaders were convinced that they needed to act with stronger actions and ignored the city's prohibition of public civil rights demonstrations. In April of 1963, Martin and the SCLC joined forces with a local movement in Birmingham and launched a massive campaign against racial discrimination in the city. The protest drew national attention when police turned dogs and fire hoses on the demonstrators, and hundreds were arrested. Martin was once more jailed and thrown into solitary confinement. While in jail, and in response to being criticized for his campaign, he drafted the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he defended his use of nonviolent but direct actions for racial equality and social justice, instead of waiting forever for justice to come. Months later, the letter was published in newspapers and magazines, and it appeared in one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s books. 4 days after writing the letter, Martin was released from prison and continued his work in Birmingham. 2 weeks later, the Children's Crusade took place, where more than 1,000 school-aged children marched through the streets, urging racial equality and an end to segregation. The young protesters were hosed down and chased by police dogs while being arrested by police officers as they were being filmed by television crews. This caused a national outrage. With Birmingham in chaos, and with the world's attention to racial segregation in the South, local officials were forced to agree to at least some of Martin's demands. President John F. Kennedy proposed a civil rights legislation to the U.S. Congress where he sought racial equality. On August 28, 1963, Martin and other civil rights leaders organized a historic massive March on Washington, where around 250,000 people gathered peacefully at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., asking for change, creating awareness of the inequalities faced by Black Americans, and demanding equal justice for all U.S. citizens. It was here that Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorable "I Have a Dream" speech was made, in which he emphasized his faith that someday all men would be treated equally. The nationwide support for civil rights resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination throughout the United States. It also provided protection of the right to vote and ended segregation in schools, public places, housing, and employment. It finally gave Black Americans full legal equality. In December of 1964, Martin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, being the youngest person at the time to receive the prestigious prize at the age of 35. Following the passage of the act, there was resistance to implement its measures, especially in the South. There were still legal barriers that denied Black Americans from their right to vote. This led Martin and the SCLC to back peaceful demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, for which once again Martin and thousands others were arrested. On March 7, 1965, around 600 people joined the peaceful march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama, in an effort to register Black voters in the South. As they were leaving Selma and reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were attacked with nightsticks, whips, and tear gas by state troopers and local authorities. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, as news reporters captured the incident live and broadcast the horrifying scene on national television. Once again, the public was enraged. Martin had organized the first march, but did not take part in it, so he organized and led another march that ended with them turning back to avoid a second confrontation. They were finally able to achieve their goal with federal protection, and on March 25, 1965, they reached the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, where Martin delivered a televised speech addressing the huge crowd. 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which guaranteed African Americans their right to vote. Martin expanded his civil rights work to larger American cities like Los Angeles and Chicago through 1967. He also started focusing his efforts on economic justice throughout the U.S. In early April 1968, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to help sanitation workers with a strike for better working conditions and fair wages. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, Martin was standing on the balcony outside his motel in Memphis when he was fatally shot and killed at the young age of 39 by James Earl Ray. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy are honored with a national holiday in the U.S. His day, known as MLK Day, is celebrated on the third Monday of January each year. He also has a memorial in his honor, located in Washington, D.C., which symbolizes the fight he led for freedom, justice, and equality. Martin Luther King Jr. has been an inspiration for millions of people in the fight for civil rights. His leadership was vital to ending segregation in the United States, and he will forever be remembered as one of the most influential civil rights leaders in history.